Welcome to another edition of the Business Brains and the Bottom Line podcast. My name is Paul Delivery, your host, and my guest today is all the way from the UK, Iain Maclean. Welcome to the show, Ian.
Thank you very much, Paul. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited about this show because you and I have a little bit in common. You wrote a book. You're the author of a book called TJ's War. It's about your dad. And our dads are of similar age and similar. Like my dad was in the Air Force, the old Army Air Corps for the United States during the war, and your father was a member of the Royal British Air Force. Did I say that correctly?
No, I'm ex-RAF, but my father was Army.
Okay, I got them mixed up then. So we have similar backgrounds in that sense that our dads, fought in World War II. So I'm excited about that. But so I always start with, you wrote the book about your dad, and I know a little bit about it because I know you've been working on that for years and years. But what was the genesis of the book? Like what possessed you? Because that's one of the first things I always ask authors is you had to have some passion to do this. What was it?
Well, there's two parts to that, I think. There's the part when I was a boy. My father was an alcoholic and he died when I was 10. And really, life calmed down after that until I was 15, and I came across a photograph of a young army officer, an arrested Nazi in the middle, and a chap in a uniform I didn't recognize on the other side. And I said to my mother, "What's this about?" And she said, "Well, that's your father." And I almost said, "Which one?" I didn't recognize any of them, but fortunately, it was a young British Army officer that was my father. And I realized that it was very hard to see the similarities with the man I remembered and the man I was looking at in the photograph. My father died when he was only 49 years old, but he'd been drinking massively, became very overweight, very full in the face. And it was very difficult to match the two. So
Sure.
I realized I didn't know anything about this man. And so I essentially spent roughly a week a year for the next 30 years,
Wow.
going to places he'd been and talking to people he'd worked with, where they would talk to me, until eventually I couldn't find anyone still alive. They'd all died of old age by about 2002, 2003.
Sure.
So that was the initial impetus to discover who my father was. I didn't have any intention to write a book. But in the meantime, of course, life goes on, and I got married when I was 28, and over the next 13 years, we had 4 children, and they grew up. And so by 2020, they're adults in their own right. They're off doing their own thing. I'm working in Saudi Arabia, and there's a lockdown. So there's nothing to do except work or be in my apartment for 15 months.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, here is the time. Now I have time to write this book. And I really wrote it. I was thinking I might for a few years, but I wrote it for my children so that they might understand what my father and your father and an entire generation went through during the Second World War. And so the motivation to discover who he was, that was one part of it. And then motivation to write the book was a separate part altogether. But I'm very happy with the result, really.
I mean, it must have been hard. I mean, so I'm assuming that in the research you do a lot of personal things, like say people he worked with. But how difficult was it to find his history when he was in the military?
The only source of that was to meet the people. And he was from 1940 onwards, he was in MI6, Military Intelligence 6, which is, the same as this fictitious James Bond. It's also James Bond was written by Ian Fleming, and Ian Fleming was in MI6. There were a lot of people in MI6 throughout the Second World War,
Sure,
including my father. And there were, and there still are not any written records that the public can get hold of. You can read some of the books that have been written since. But these are not official documents. They're not sanctioned by the UK government. And so you can't actually get hold of the military record for, in my case, my father. So I really, the only source I had was to go to people that he'd been with.
Right.
And
how did you find that out? How were you able to find those folks?
My mother knew nothing about his war record. She met him in 1949. And so I really started with his sister, Jean, who lived until 2003. And she knew a very small amount about his activities during the war. But she knew some of the names, 4 names, and that started me off.
Okay.
And so it was essentially a bit like going down a tree trunk and getting to the roots of the tree trunk and going down one path, and it would lead on and lead on and lead on, and eventually you'd reach a dead end and have to come back up and go down another route. And that happened right throughout my 20s and 30s. There were some major theaters of war that he was involved in, and they were quite separate from each other. So Norway, I spent some time bouncing off people in Norway who knew other people in Norway and so on. And the same in Ireland, and the same in Bermuda, and the same in Italy. But it was there were many times when I just got lucky. When it was just a tiny strand, I think this chap over here might have known something about your dad, and sure enough, or sometimes not.
Yeah.
And then there was the issue about whether they wanted to talk about it, because all MI6 agents are trained to never speak about what they do with anybody outside the service. But here was a man simply asking about his father, and so. Most of the time, people would open up a bit and just reveal bits of information. And I was able to piece these together over 30 years, over 40 years nearly.
Well, man, I give you credit. You got to have some staying power to do that. I had the right incentive. I mean, my reaction when my father died, my father would come home. He would leave the house at 10 o'clock in the morning. And I can remember this look in his face. It would be the same look in his face every morning when he went out the door at 10 o'clock. And it was apologetic. Yeah.
He knew what he was trying to do. He knew that he was drinking himself to death. He would say to me many times, "You'll soon be the man of the house."
Wow.
And off he'd go. And then he would stay out all day because he'd find pub after pub after pub where he could drink. And then he'd come home about 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, having drunk so much beer that his stomach would be distended. He'd be leaning over, hardly able to stand up. And I, as a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old boy, would then help him upstairs and get him to crash on a bed, and off he'd go to sleep. And that happened every single day.
Wow.
We had I grew up in a hotel that my mother owned and ran. He owned it too, but he had nothing to do with it apart from drink the profits.
Sure.
So when he died, and although I didn't know it at the time, I had found him dead. I brought up his breakfast, and he was already dead by that point, but I didn't know it.
Wow. You thought he was sleeping
my mother
still.
Then he looked as if he was sleeping, yes.
Yeah.
My mother then went up a couple of hours later and found him in exactly the same position and realized that he was dead, had been dead since the middle of the night.
Sure.
and she screamed from the top of the stairs that he's dead. My immediate reaction was relief. I'm 10, I'm nearly 11 years old. And my immediate reaction was relief. And that really didn't change until I found this photograph when I was 15. And then this massive, over the years, this grief and guilt came over me that that's how I had at some point in the past thought about him. And the more I discovered about his story, the more I realized why he drank. And I also realized that this story is repeated over and over again, right across the world. There's many aspects to this, but atrocities are committed. If you read about atrocities that are committed in Second World War and other theaters of war where women and children are murdered and terrible things happen, they tend to happen by soldiers and others who are either drunk on alcohol or on other drugs. People who are in their normal states of mind cannot commit these atrocities. Yes, they can go into battles and they can fight and they do so bravely, but these are where the battles like that, it's soldiers against soldiers, and in whatever way that might be fair enough. But where they commit war crimes, these tend to be committed by people who have, for one way or another, are not in their right minds. And alcohol plays a massive part in that, and always has done.
Okay. So when your dad was in the war, I'm guessing here, he was drinking back in those days as well, right?
That's where the drinking started.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I know from my own experience in the Royal Air Force, drinking is a massive part of being in the military.
Yeah.
It's massively encouraged. You get young lads at 18 years old and women, and part of the camaraderie, part of the bravado is the drinking culture.
Yeah. Well, that era of men, the World War II guys, they're a little bit different than today. Like today, I think people are more open about their feelings. That generation, they never said a word. Like my father never said a word about World War II, ever. Right. I had an uncle, I think I may have told you this. I had an uncle that was a prisoner of war in Germany for a couple of years. And my cousins, that I talk to all the time, their father never said a word about it. And he was like tortured, abused, and just came home from war and just went to work.
Yeah.
The different.
And my mother's brother, my Uncle William, he and my father did this too. They came back from the war. They had all these medals. They stuck them in a drawer. Never opened the drawer again.
Yeah.
My Uncle William was a navigator in Bomber Command during the war. He regarded what he did as a war crime. And there were many like him who got into aircraft and went across to France and Germany and Italy and bombed cities where they killed civilians. And they regarded what they were doing as war crimes.
Really?
They didn't want to talk about it ever.
Yeah, that has to be tough. I mean, you're following orders, right? You're doing what you're told to do, but there's going to be a lot of collateral damage when you do that. I mean, just no different than what's going on today in the Middle East, right? A lot of collateral damage that's going on, and I don't know how you avoid that in war, though. I am certainly not a war expert, but it's going to happen. I don't know how you avoid that.
I'm with you, Paul. I'm not a war expert either. I do not understand war. I do not understand how we take the best of our youth and we train them up to kill people.
Yep.
Send them out and they go ahead and kill people. And these very same people that they're killing, after somebody rings a bell, we're all friends again and shaking hands and welcome them into our houses and all the rest. What is all that about?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't figured out. Well, like right now, as we speak, we got the Russian-Ukraine war, right? God only knows when that thing's going to end. Then we've got the Israel-Palestinian war, and I don't think that has any end in sight. And these are neighboring countries, right? I mean, I don't know. I'm glad I live in the United States, to be honest with you. We're a little bit isolated from that. So for someone to attack us, we'd see it coming like 3 days ahead of time. So I think, I like that we got the Atlantic on one side and the Pacific on the other.
I don't think you've got 3 days anymore.
Yeah, that's true too. No, nuclear weapons, yeah, but that's the scariest part. Now we're getting a little political here, but to me, that's the scariest part about who has their finger on the trigger. Russia has tons of nuclear. Well, they have more than us, actually. And you just don't know what people are capable of. The North Korea, their leader, he has nukes. I don't know. Iran.
There's a lot of countries with nukes these days.
Yeah, Iran. They scare me.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
but
they're
anyway,
all playing chess.
Yeah, so we're getting a little off track here. So,
What's the track?
Yeah. So, what are some of the things you learned about your dad? 30 years of research. What are some of the highlights that you learned? And then we'll get into I hear a rumor that you're trying to get a movie made. We'll touch on that a little later.
So, I think it's important to understand his background. Now, the Macleans, in the Highlands of Scotland, it used to be the case that the names were very territorial.
Okay.
So MacLeods came from Skye, and MacDonalds came from Glencoe, and Macleans came from the island of Mull. And this goes back over 1,000 years. Now, my particular branch of Macleans made their way up from Mull to Tiree, and then from Tiree to the Isle of Lewis, and then from the Isle of Lewis onto the mainland of Scotland around about 1790, at which point they were crofters and fishermen.
Okay.
Just around about 1820, the Highlands went through what they called the clearances, where the rich people who owned the land, typically not from Scotland, let's put it like that, we were at a point where 5 people owned 90% of the land in Scotland.
Oh, wow.
And they wanted to remove the people and farm sheep. So they simply got rid of all the people in Scotland, got them shipped across to America and Canada, which is why you find a lot of Scots people there. Same with Ireland.
Yep.
And my Finlayson ancestry, they were sheep farmers in the borders, and they were then shipped up to the north of Scotland to farm sheep up there.
So let me stop you right there. I do have a question for you. When we were in Scotland, I went there last year. I heard there's actually more sheep than people in Scotland. Is that true? I think Ireland too.
That's true. That's true.
There's like 5.
Still true. Yeah.
What's the population of Scotland? 5 million, maybe?
Between 5 and 6 million.
Yeah, somewhere around there. But it's true, though. Yeah. On the countryside, everywhere you go, there's just sheep, herds of sheep everywhere.
Yeah, especially in the Highlands, because there's no fences, there's no real fields. They just send them out in the mountains, and then in the spring, they pull them in for the lambing. It's too cold for the lambs to be out in the mountain.
Yep.
So carrying on with the Finlaysons just for a little bit longer, they farmed the sheep, and then around about 1850, Queen Victoria married Prince Albert, who was a German. He was heavily into hunting. So they had Balmoral Estate up in Scotland.
Okay.
And they liked to get their friends up to go hunting. And so it became very fashionable to go hunting for game all over Scotland. So they realized that they don't want sheep anymore. Sheep are not nearly as important as getting deer and grouse and so on onto the land. So the shepherds became gamekeepers.
Okay.
And so James Finlayson, my great-great-grandfather, became a gamekeeper in the Dundonald estate. And then the Macleans married the Finlaysons a little bit later. And my father used to go hunting as an 8, 9, 10-year-old boy with his grandfather, also called John Finlayson, who was one of their descendants. And they would go out into the mountains and stay 3 or 4 days, climbing through the mountains, all kinds of weather, surviving. And my father gained a great deal of fieldcraft from that time. he was born in 1921, and so early on in the war, he was a private in an army unit that was sent out into Norway to stop the Germans from getting nickel from the north of Norway, which is a key ingredient for armored plated steel. So he was halfway up Norway with a detachment that were completely unprepared for the weather. They got their backsides kicked by the Germans, who were incredibly well equipped. And my father was left with 5 other privates and a mortally wounded captain in the middle of nowhere. And because of my skill, because of my father's skill with fieldcraft, he was able to get these men, including the captain, over a period of 2 days across the mountains to a free Norwegian camp where they were then safe. Unfortunately, the captain died just as they arrived at the camp.
And now, was this
just so happened that
was this wintertime?
Yeah, well, no, it was late April 1940.
Okay, because I was going to say, I can't imagine that had to be a rugged terrain if it was wintertime.
Rugged terrain, and remember, he was born in 1921. So what age was he in 1940? He was 19.
He was a teenager. He was a kid.
Teenager. And yet he managed to get these men and the captain in enemy territory, because the Germans were everywhere, across the mountains to a free Norwegian camp. And it just so happened that General Ruge, who was in charge of the Free Norwegian Army, was in this camp. And my father got to him and he said, by the way, here are the numbers of German troops in this location and in this location and in this location that we came across. Here's what equipment they had, and here was the direction they were going in. And General Ruge said, okay, went off, wrote a letter and gave it to him. And he said, if you manage to get back to Scotland, give this to your commanding officer. Cut long story short, the letter said, promote this man and put him in military intelligence.
Really? Okay.
So that was how it started. And then he went off and he had quite an interesting start to the war after that. But the war just grinds on, and mission after mission after mission. So he met another agent, a woman, and they fell in love, and they tried to meet each other as often as they could. But at the same time, they were both MI6 agents and both being sent off on missions in the meantime. So that was extremely difficult to manage. And alcohol played a greater and greater part in his ability to sustain himself through the war. So that by the end of the war, he, like many hundreds of thousands of others, was a full-blown alcoholic.
And how old was he when he got out of the military?
He was still in MI6 until 1959.
Oh, wow. So he was in that for a while then. Okay.
He was in there for a long time.
Okay.
But the book only deals with his early life up until he met my mother, which was 1949. Okay. And even, it deals in detail up until the end of the Second World War. But then I've been able to find out less and less about what he got up to between 1945 and when he met my mother. And what he did after he met my mother, when he would go off onto his various missions in Canada and so on, I've never been able to find out what he did.
Wow.
So all of that's a mystery even now.
Yeah. So I'm assuming he's a very, got a lot of highly decorated war veteran.
He got a fair number of medals, but he put them in the drawer and he didn't want to know.
Yeah.
He was for example, the D-Day landings, which are just commemorated now.
Yep. I saw that.
Do you remember The Longest Day? Do you remember that film?
I do, actually. Yes.
Yeah. People of our age tend to remember it. Well, the Lovat Scouts were portrayed in there. The head of the Lovat Scouts, the chief of the clan, was portrayed by Peter Lorre. I think it's Lorre, his name was. this was all a true story. But he came ashore, and he had a piper who piped him ashore, and the piper didn't carry a gun. He just played the bagpipes, and the Germans thought he was mad, so they didn't shoot him. But he played the bagpipes as the Lovat Scouts came ashore, and that's in The Longest Day. Well, the real piper, Pipe Major MacLeod, he took a train up from London to be the piper at my father's wedding to my mother. So
Right.
A number of people around the world knew what my father got up to, but my father wasn't about medals, and a lot of the times that he did things were not talked about by anybody. So medals were not a big thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So was he involved in the D-Day invasion?
He was in Norway during the D-Day.
Got it. Okay.
The idea with a lot of the agents, he wasn't alone in this. Churchill's idea was to set Europe ablaze, keep Hitler guessing where the invasion was going to come from. So he was part of the Norwegian resistance, harrying the Germans, and in fact, making them think that there was a strong possibility the invasion was going to be into Norway, and that they were going to make their way down from Norway and make their way up from Italy.
Yeah.
All to take the attention away from the Normandy landings.
Well, they had, again, not being a war expert, you've heard this many times, is trying to fight wars on several fronts is difficult.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what that's ultimately what probably won the war for, the Allied troops, is that we were hitting them from every direction.
Correct. It's a very good tactic. In the first Gulf War, Norman Schwarzkopf did exactly the same thing. He made the Iraqis think that because of what the Saudis were doing with their army, he made them think that they were coming across at a certain point, but actually they weren't. They were coming across at a completely different point. So just diverting the focus. Yeah,
keep them getting. So I thinking back in those days, there was no technology. Now with technology today, with aerial, satellites, you can see people coming a mile away. So war has really changed.
It has. It's true. But at the same time, there's almost too much information.
Yeah.
And so the people who are making decisions are getting information overload all the time.
Yeah.
And that's almost as bad as having no information.
Yeah, no. So, well, that's some great stories. So let's switch directions a little bit. A little birdie told me you're trying to make a movie out of this book, and how's that going? Where are we at?
Well, it's going remarkably well. When I published the book, just before I published the book, maybe about 2 months beforehand, I decided that I should publish an audiobook at the same time because. I can't tell you why I thought that, but anyway, I did. So I put out a casting, and this chap called David Blair, who's an actor. He's in his early 50s now. He probably doesn't want me to tell you that, but he's been an actor for over 30 years, a very fine actor. And he read a passage from the book, and I just went, that's our guy. That's the guy. And he's done a fantastic job of the audiobook. It's 23 and a half hours long, but people love it. I've listened to it, several times, and I know what's going to happen next. So I strongly commend that to everyone. But he and I have been discussing many times the potential for turning this into a film. David's been involved in films and TVs all of his life, series all of his life. And I thought, it's a good story. I've been watching films my whole life too. And, things like The Dam Busters and The Longest Day and all these other great films of the 40s and 50s. And there's been many great films since too, the Saving Private Ryan, all of this stuff. So yeah, I think I think while My Father's Story is an amazing story, it's just happens to be one of many, many stories out there. But I think that now it's written, it could make a film. So David and I decided back in February, late February, early March, to start a podcast called we're going to make a $50 million movie.
So you two are co-hosting this, or are you the host? And
we're co-hosting.
Okay.
We co-host that podcast, and we deliberately chose that title to put the words out into the universe.
Sure.
When I'm working in my professional life, anytime somebody says, I'm going to try and do this, I said, you're not going to try and do this. You're either going to do it or you're not going to do it.
Yeah.
And so don't get me try. And that's what we've got with this title. We're going to make a $50 million movie. And it's a positive statement of intent that's out into the universe. And since we started, my goodness, I honestly believe we're going to make a $50 million movie. The response so far has been fantastic. We've met people that I could only have dreamed of meeting.
Yeah.
We've built up you know the book or the film, The Lord of the Rings.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Well, there's a fellowship. What's his name? Frodo starts out on this journey and very quickly develops a fellowship of the ring with people who help him get to the other end. That's exactly what's going on with this podcast. We have pulled people in. Sia.
Right.
Sia's joined us. And before Sia, there's Mark Reed, who's got this fantastic podcast across in Japan. He joined us. Sincera, who does our intros and outros, he's joined us. We've got Quinn, who's this incredible chap in the background putting all these videos together. And there's more and more coming on board. Yeah. And we're talking to producers in the UK and in America. And it's I don't know how long the journey is going to be, but it's great fun, and it's all going in the right direction.
Yeah, and you hit it right in the head. Enjoy the process, right? Enjoy the ride, wherever it leads you. I would think you'll get some producer and some movie company to step up and say, we want to make this a movie. Yeah, I would think. Yeah. I'm no expert on movies. I'm not an expert on a lot of things, by the way. But I would think, it sounds like you got a great story, and I would think all it takes is one, right? It takes one person to say, we're going to do it.
Yeah, completely right. Completely right. And, I wouldn't be here talking to you if we didn't start that podcast.
Right.
This is all part of the same tapestry. It's just, what are we talking about? We're not really talking about movies. We're talking about life, the universe, and everything, right?
That's right. Yeah,
I love that.
I've said this to many people. I started this podcast about 3-4 years ago. I've got about 100 or so episodes out there, and I have met some wonderful people. I've had people from Australia. I've had a few people from the UK, Canada. It's been great. I've met some wonderful, wonderful people that I would have never met if not for this podcast. Yeah. And, Tanya,
when do you get a chance to tell people about you?
Right. Yeah. And that's always nice too. Yeah. I've only done one solo episode, and that was when I spent a couple of days in a Mexican prison, but you'll have to go and listen to that episode.
We've got more in common than you know.
Yeah. No, we do. We're similar age. Our fathers both served in World War II. My father would be 100 if he was alive today. I think yours is a couple of years older.
Yeah, mine's 103. Yeah.
Very probably, although my father wasn't a drinker, to his credit, he had a lot of other things. He had a lot of other issues, but drinking wasn't one of them.
Good.
But yeah, no, we had a lot of similarities, and it's nice to connect with people that have similar type experiences in life,
Paul, I spent a couple of days in an Algerian prison in the middle of the Sahara Desert. So you and I have definitely got to swap stories about being in prison.
I'd love to hear that. We don't have enough time today, but yeah, we definitely have to get together over a pint. So I think I told you
I'd love that.
Yeah, I definitely would be coming over. So my daughter's living in Scotland right now, and I don't think she's coming home.
Cool.
So
Great.
We'll be heading over your way, at some point. My whole family's going to be heading over there tomorrow for girls. My 3 daughters and my wife are over there for a girls' week, so that'll be fun. But yeah, I plan on heading over your direction at some point.
We're within 10 miles of Gatwick Airport.
Yep.
So if I find that you've come into London and you've not stopped to see us, you're in trouble.
I know. I have to stop now. So, and usually there's I live in the Dallas area. Doesn't seem to many direct flights to the UK. So a lot of times there's layovers in Britain at some point, in London somewhere.
Yeah.
So that'll give me.
You come and see us. I've been to Dallas a few times. I used to do a lot of work with Sabre. Have you come across Sabre in Dallas?
I know exactly where they are. Yep, very familiar with them. Well, they do a lot of the ticketing for American Airlines and things of that sort.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So cool. Well, hey, Ian, if you got a podcast now, throw it out there, the name of it and where they can find it. And if someone wants to get in touch with you for whatever reason, how would they do that?
Thank you. So the podcast is called We're Going to Make a $50 Million Movie. Just put any of those words really into YouTube and you'll come up with us. We're is WE'.
Okay.
And we're also on Spotify for the podcast. The website is tjswar.com.
Okay.
And if you go there first, then the links to the podcast, the links to lots of videos that we've produced and photographs that I've come across during my research and other documents, that's all on the website. I have to say that the story, and you can buy the book through the webcast as well, through the website. But I have to say that the story is if you love war and you love guns and this kind of thing and playing with guns, this story is not really for you. It is a war story, but it is an anti-war story.
Sure.
And it is a love story.
Yeah. No, I hear you. That makes complete sense. So, well, hey, Ian, this has been great. I've really enjoyed. This is a fun conversation for me. I've really enjoyed this, and
me.
Like I said, I hope to meet you face to face on one of these days, and I think that's going to happen sooner rather than later.
Please, the idea of having a pint together and discussing a lot more than we've covered the tip of the iceberg on both sides here. So there's a lot to cover.
Absolutely. So, well, hey, that's a wrap for another edition of the Business Brains and Bottom Line podcast. My name is Paul Delegro, your host. Until next time.